The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, Mountain Standard Time. Deep within the concrete bunkers of Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, Colonel Marcus Webb stared at the communications board with growing unease. 8 aircraft had departed on a classified mission into hostile territory 6 hours earlier. 7 had checked in according to schedule. 1 had gone completely silent. Raven 7, this is Control. Report status over. The communications officer's voice carried across the operations center, professional but tinged with concern. Nothing but static answered back. Webb's jaw tightened as he watched the digital displays. The mission had been routine by Air Force standards, a precision strike against insurgent positions in a valley that intelligence assured them was lightly defended, the kind of operation they'd executed hundreds of times before. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. At 3:55 hours, the first aircraft began limping home. Raven 3's voice crackled through the speakers, the pilot's words clipped and urgent. Control, this is Raven 3. We've got multiple aircraft down. Sam's sights were not where intelligence indicated. Repeat, Sam's sights were not marked on our tactical displays. We flew into a trap. Webb felt his blood turn cold. 7 aircraft had entered that valley. As the minutes ticked by, only 6 voices checked in over the radio. The 7th pilot, call sign Raven 7, remained mysteriously absent from all communications. The aircraft's transponder had gone dark somewhere over enemy territory, and satellite imagery showed only smoke and debris scattered across the valley floor. By 4:30 hours, the grim reality had crystallized. Webb stood before his assembled staff, his voice heavy with the weight of command. Ladies and gentlemen, based on all available intelligence and reconnaissance data, I'm officially declaring Raven 7 as KIA. No parachute was observed. No emergency beacon detected. No survivor radio contact established. He paused, letting the finality of his words sink in. We have no survivors from that aircraft. The operations center fell into the kind of silence that follows terrible news. Young airmen stared at their displays, processing the loss of one of their own. The missing pilot had been part of their squadron for 3 years, known for precision flying and an almost supernatural ability to bring damaged aircraft home. But even the best pilots couldn't survive a direct SAM hit. Webb turned back to his communications board, already drafting the casualty notification that would shatter a family back home. The paperwork of war was always the hardest part, reducing a human life to incident reports and next-of-kin notifications. He'd written too many of these letters, and each one felt like carving pieces from his own soul. What none of them knew, as they began the solemn process of declaring their squadron mate dead, was that 200 miles away, something impossible was happening in the darkness of the Afghan mountains. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and amber as the surviving aircraft of Strike Package Bravo touched down at Nellis Air Force Base. Each A-10 Thunderbolt II bore the scars of combat, bullet holes puncturing titanium skin, hydraulic fluid staining the tarmac, and the acrid smell of burned electronics filling the air. The ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, but their usual banter was absent. Everyone knew about Raven 7. Captain Diana Valkyrie Kozlov had been the squadron's most experienced A-10 pilot, a 12-year veteran who'd flown more close air support missions than most pilots flew training sorties. Her aircraft, tail number 780651, was a battle-tested Warthog that she'd personally maintained and modified over 3 deployments. The nose art depicted a fierce Nordic warrior woman with flowing auburn hair, a reflection of Kozlov's own striking appearance and warrior spirit. But respect hadn't come easily for Valkyrie. In a squadron dominated by male pilots fresh from flight school, her competence was constantly questioned despite her combat record. They called her Mom behind her back, dismissing her tactical insights as overcautious. When she advocated for additional reconnaissance before the mission, the younger pilots had rolled their eyes. Valkyrie's being paranoid again, they'd whispered. The mission briefing had been routine. Intelligence indicated light anti-aircraft presence in the target zone, maybe some small arms fire, possibly a few outdated surface-to-air missiles. The 7 aircraft strike package would enter the valley in tight formation, deliver their ordnance on confirmed insurgent positions, and return to base before dawn. Simple, clean, effective. Kozlov had studied the satellite imagery for hours, noting the terrain features and potential escape routes. Something about the mission felt wrong, but she couldn't articulate why. The valley was too quiet, too perfect for an ambush. When she'd voiced her concerns during the briefing, Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had dismissed them with barely concealed irritation. "Captain Kozlov, we appreciate your cautious approach to mission planning," Hayes had said, his tone suggesting anything but appreciation. "However, intelligence has thoroughly vetted this target. We're dealing with a small insurgent cell, not the Iraqi Republican Guard." The other pilots had snickered. Captain Torch Morrison, a hotshot pilot half her age with twice her arrogance, had leaned back in his chair. "Come on, Valkyrie. Not every mission is Fallujah. Sometimes a milk run is just a milk run." But as the surviving aircraft taxied toward their parking spots, the silence spoke volumes about how wrong they'd all been. The valley had indeed been a trap, a carefully orchestrated ambush with concealed SAM sites positioned at choke points throughout the terrain. Modern Russian-made missiles had torn through their formation like invisible predators, turning routine into catastrophe in mere seconds. Now, as rescue teams prepared for another fruitless search mission, one question haunted everyone at Nellie's. What had really happened to Diana Kozlov and her A-10 in those final moments over enemy territory? The briefing room at 800 hours was thick with tension and the smell of burnt coffee. The surviving pilots sat in metal folding chairs, their flight suits still stained with sweat and hydraulic fluid from the previous night's mission. Each man carried the weight of survival guilt, that peculiar burden of those who return when others don't. Captain James Torch Morrison shifted uncomfortably as Colonel Webb entered the room. Morrison's usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. The cocky confidence that had defined his personality seemed to have evaporated somewhere over the Afghan mountains. "Gentlemen," Webb began, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years in uniform, "I need each of you to walk me through exactly what happened in that valley. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." First Lieutenant Snake Rodriguez spoke first, his voice hoarse from breathing smoke and shouting into his radio. "Sir, we entered the valley in standard attack formation. Valkyrie was flying left wing, about 200 meters off my starboard side. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited. At first, everything looked normal." "Define normal, Lieutenant." "No visible ground activity, sir. No muzzle flashes, no vehicle movement. The target buildings appeared unoccupied, just like intelligence briefed." Rodriguez paused, swallowing hard. "That should have been our first warning sign, sir. Villages in that region are never completely empty." Captain Morrison leaned forward, his usual swagger replaced by something resembling humility. "Sir, Valkyrie tried to warn us. About 3 minutes before we reached the target zone, she called out suspicious terrain features over the radio. Said the ridgelines looked too clean, too symmetrical. I told her she was overthinking it." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Webb made a note on his legal pad, his expression unreadable. "Continue, Captain." "The SAMs came from everywhere at once," Morrison continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Not just 1 or 2 positions, we're talking coordinated fire from at least 6 different sites. Modern missiles, sir. Not the old Soviet junk we were briefed to expect. These were tracking us from the moment we entered that valley." Staff Sergeant Wheels Thompson, the mission's electronic warfare specialist, cleared his throat. "Sir, I was monitoring communications throughout the engagement. Valkyrie's aircraft took the first hit, starboard engine. I heard her over the radio, calm as ever, reporting the damage and adjusting her attack profile. Even with one engine down and missile fragments in her wing, she was still trying to coordinate our defensive maneuvers. Webb's pen stopped moving. She was still flying, still in command. Yes, sir. Actually, that's what saved most of us. When the SAMs started flying, we all started to panic, breaking formation, every man for himself. But Valkyrie's voice cut through the chaos. She called out missile launches, directed evasive maneuvers, even talked Lieutenant Chen through a hydraulics failure. If she hadn't maintained tactical control of the situation, Thompson's voice trailed off. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The pilot they dismissed as overcautious had become their lifeline in the crucible of combat. What was her last transmission? Webb asked quietly. Morrison's face went pale. She said she was going down but had eyes on a high-value target. Last thing we heard was, "Tell them I kept the faith." None of them had understood what those final words meant. Not yet. The search and rescue briefing room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a military operation swinging into high gear. Maps covered every available surface, marked with grid coordinates, elevation data, and the scattered debris fields where 6 other aircraft had already been located and recovered. But one aircraft remained missing, somewhere in the maze of valleys and ridges that comprised some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Major Patricia Dustoff Williams commanded the 66th Rescue Squadron, a unit that specialized in extracting personnel from impossible situations. A former helicopter pilot herself, Williams understood the psychological dynamics of combat survival better than most. She studied the faces of the pilots around the briefing table, men who'd flown home, while their squadron mate remained missing in action. "The debris pattern doesn't make sense," announced Captain Derek Nash, the squadron's intelligence officer. He pointed to a satellite photograph showing the valley where the engagement had occurred. "We've located wreckage from 6 aircraft, but Raven 7's impact site remains unidentified. Either the aircraft was completely vaporized, which is unlikely given the A-10's construction, or it went down somewhere outside our current search grid." Williams leaned over the map, tracing flight paths with her finger. What was Captain Kozlov's last known position? "Grid reference 41RPQ 12,345, 67,890, Nash replied, consulting his notes. "But that's based on the other pilot's recollections, not hard data." Her transponder went dark approximately 30 seconds before her final radio transmission. The room filled with the kind of silence that accompanies bad news. Without electronic tracking data, finding one aircraft in thousands of square miles of mountainous terrain was like searching for a needle in a haystack, if the haystack were actively trying to kill you. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the base's senior intelligence officer, spread additional photographs across the table. "We've had Predator drones over the area for 6 hours. No emergency beacons detected, no visible wreckage, no survivor signals. The terrain in that region includes numerous deep ravines and caves. If the aircraft went down in one of those areas..." "She could have survived," Williams interrupted, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd seen the impossible happen before. "The A-10 is built like a tank. Pilots have walked away from crashes that should have been unsurvivable. Until we have physical evidence that Captain Kozlov is KIA, we treat this as a rescue operation, not a recovery mission." But the mathematics of survival in hostile territory were unforgiving. Even if Kozlov had survived the initial impact, she would be facing extreme weather conditions, potential injuries, hostile enemy forces, and the psychological pressure of isolation. Military doctrine assumed that downed pilots could survive approximately 72 hours before requiring medical intervention. Time was running out. "Sir," interjected Captain Morrison, who'd been unusually quiet throughout the briefing, "there's something else. During the engagement, Valkyrie mentioned seeing a high-value target. She said she was going down but had eyes on something important. What if? What if she didn't crash where we think she did? Williams looked up from the maps, her expression sharpening. Explain. The A-10 can glide for miles even with engine damage. If she spotted something worth pursuing, Valkyrie might have stretched her range far beyond our current search parameters. She's exactly the kind of pilot who would try to complete the mission even while going down. It was a sobering possibility that their missing pilot had potentially flown deeper into enemy territory, trading her own chances of rescue for one final opportunity to strike at the enemy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the operations center as rescue teams prepared for another sortie into the mountains. But unknown to everyone at Nellie's Air Force Base, Diana Kozlov was very much alive and about to make a decision that would change everything. The high-altitude air above the Hindu Kush Mountains was thin and bitter cold as Captain Diana Kozlov regained consciousness in the shattered cockpit of her A-10. Blood trickled from a gash above her left eyebrow, and her right shoulder throbbed with what felt like a dislocated joint. But she was alive, which was more than she'd expected after watching a Russian-made surface-to-air missile punch through her starboard engine like a tungsten fist. The aircraft had auto-rotated through nearly 8,000 feet of vertical descent before the damaged flight controls responded to her inputs. Years of training and an almost supernatural understanding of her aircraft's capabilities had allowed her to execute what test pilots called a controlled crash, turning a certain fatality into merely a probable one. Her A-10, tail number 780651, had come to rest on a narrow ledge overlooking a deep valley. The impact had been devastating. Both engines were destroyed, the left wing was nearly severed, and hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the fuselage like mechanical blood. But the titanium bathtub that formed the cockpit had held, protecting her from the worst of the impact forces. Kozlov keyed her survival radio, hopping for any response from friendly forces. Any station, this is Raven 7. I am alive and conscious at grid reference." She paused, consulting her GPS unit which flickered intermittently. "Unknown at this time. Aircraft is non-flyable. I am okay for now." Static answered her transmission. The mountains interfered with radio signals, and her emergency beacon had been damaged during the crash. For the first time in her 12-year military career, Diana Kozlov was completely alone. But as she unbuckled her harness and began conducting a post-crash inventory, something caught her attention through the spider-webbed canopy glass. Below her position, perhaps a mile down the valley, she could see a complex of buildings that hadn't appeared in any intelligence briefings. The structures were too large and too organized to be civilian dwellings, yet too concealed to be military installations. Through her binoculars, Kozlov observed what appeared to be a significant enemy command center. Vehicles moved between buildings, and she counted at least 30 personnel moving with the kind of disciplined precision that suggested military training. Most importantly, she could see communication antennas and what looked like radar equipment. This was the high-value target she'd mentioned in her final transmission, the real reason the SAM ambush had been so precisely coordinated. Intelligence had been wrong about more than just the location of anti-aircraft weapons. They'd completely missed a major enemy installation. Kozlov reached for her tactical radio, attempting to contact any friendly forces who might be monitoring emergency frequencies. Broken arrow," she whispered into the microphone, using the code phrase for troops in contact with enemy forces. "This is Raven 7. I have eyes on a significant enemy installation. Grid reference." But the radio remained silent. She was too far from friendly forces, too deep in hostile territory for normal communication equipment to bridge the distance. Yet the intelligence value of her discovery was immense, potentially worth dozens of American lives if the information could be transmitted back to base. Diana Kozlov faced an impossible choice. She could focus on her own survival, using her training and equipment to evade enemy forces until rescue arrived. Or she could find a way to transmit her intelligence about the enemy installation, knowing that doing so would likely compromise her position and eliminate any chance of rescue. As darkness began to settle over the Afghan mountains, the pilot, who'd been dismissed as overcautious, prepared to make the most important decision of her military career. Night fell across the mountainous terrain like a black curtain, bringing with it temperatures that dropped below freezing and the constant threat of enemy patrols. Diana Kozlov had spent the daylight hours conducting a detailed reconnaissance of the enemy installation below her position, using her flight helmet's night vision equipment and survival binoculars to map the facility's layout and activities. What she discovered was far more significant than a simple command post. The installation appeared to be a sophisticated coordination center for insurgent operations across the entire region. She'd observed high-ranking enemy officers arriving by helicopter, communication equipment that could coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles, and what appeared to be weapons storage bunkers built into the mountainside. But transmitting this intelligence would require her to activate high-power radio equipment that would immediately reveal her position to enemy forces. The crashed A-10's communication system was still partially functional, but using it would be like lighting a beacon in the darkness. Every enemy unit in the area would converge on her location within hours. Kozlov opened her survival kit and inventoried her resources with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most respected pilots in the squadron. Emergency rations for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, cold weather gear, and her sidearm with 2 spare magazines. Enough to survive for perhaps a week if she remained hidden, but woefully inadequate for sustained combat. Her shoulder throbbed with each movement, probably dislocated during the crash impact. Using a technique she'd learned during survival training, she braced herself against the cockpit frame and forced the joint back into place. The pain was excruciating, but the arm was functional again. Through her night vision equipment, she watched enemy patrols moving through the valley below. They were searching for her aircraft, following a systematic grid pattern that would eventually lead them to her position. She estimated perhaps 6 hours before they found the crash site. At 3:47 hours local time, Kozlov made her decision. She activated her survival radio and began transmitting on the emergency frequency, knowing that every word might be her last communication with friendly forces. Any station, this is Captain Diana Kozlov, call sign Raven 7. I am alive at grid reference 34S594,514 3,801,250. My aircraft is destroyed, but I have discovered a major enemy installation. I am transmitting tactical intelligence that could save American lives. For 15 minutes, she transmitted everything she'd observed: building layouts, personnel strength, vehicle positions, communication equipment, and defensive positions. She described helicopter landing zones, supply routes, and what appeared to be planned operations being coordinated from the facility. When she finished the transmission, Kozlov knew her fate was sealed. Enemy direction-finding equipment would have triangulated her position within minutes. Radio intercept teams would be dispatched to capture or eliminate her, but the intelligence she'd transmitted was worth dozens of American lives. She gathered her survival gear and began moving away from the aircraft, seeking defensive positions in the rocky terrain above the crash site. Behind her, the wreckage of 780651 sat like a metal gravestone in the moonlight, marking the spot where Captain Diana, Valkyrie, Kozlov had chosen duty over survival. In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching vehicles. The hunt was beginning. But Diana Kozlov had no intention of dying quietly in these mountains. If enemy forces wanted to capture her, they would pay a price that would be remembered long after her name appeared on casualty lists. The first enemy patrol reached the crash site at dawn, their movements cautious but confident. Through her concealed position in a rocky outcropping 200 meters upslope from the wreckage, Kozlov watched 8 fighters advance toward her destroyed A-10. They moved with tactical discipline, suggesting these weren't local irregulars but trained soldiers. She'd chosen her defensive position carefully during the night, a natural fortress formed by massive granite boulders with multiple escape routes and clear fields of fire. Her M9 pistol was loaded and ready, though she harbored no illusions about the outcome of a firefight against superior numbers with automatic weapons. The patrol leader approached her aircraft and began examining the cockpit. Even from her distant position, Kozlov could see his confusion when he discovered the pilot's seat was empty. He gestured to his men, and they began spreading out in a search pattern. Her survival training had emphasized that evading capture was often more valuable than engaging enemy forces. Every hour she remained free was another hour for rescue forces to locate and extract her. But as she watched the patrol methodically searching for her tracks, Kozlov realized that escape was becoming increasingly unlikely. The patrol leader spoke into a handheld radio, presumably reporting their findings to higher command. Within minutes, additional vehicles appeared on the rough mountain road below. This was becoming a full-scale manhunt, with resources being diverted from other operations to locate one American pilot. At 8:47 hours, one of the searchers found her bootprints in a patch of soft soil near the aircraft. He called out to the others, pointing toward the rocky slope where she'd taken refuge. The hunt was about to intensify. Kozlov checked her weapon one final time and settled into a firing position behind the granite boulder. She'd been trained for this scenario at survival school, but the reality was far more terrifying than any simulation. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged animal. The first enemy fighter appeared between the rocks 50 meters below her position, moving cautiously up the steep slope. He was young, perhaps 20 years old, carrying an AK-47 with practiced familiarity. In different circumstances, he might have been a student or a farmer. Now he was hunting her with the intent to kill or capture. She could hear others approaching from different angles, attempting to surround her position. Their tactics were sound. They'd done this before. But Kozlov had advantages they might not expect: superior training, intimate knowledge of American rescue procedures, and the desperate courage of someone who understood that capture meant either execution or use as propaganda. As the first fighter climbed within 30 meters of her position, Kozlov made a decision that would echo through military history. Instead of engaging immediately, she activated her survival radio one more time, broadcasting on the emergency frequency that she knew enemy forces would be monitoring. "This is Captain Diana Kozlov, United States Air Force. I am alive and resisting capture at grid reference 34S594,514 3,801,250. The intelligence I transmitted contains information that could save hundreds of American lives. Do not let my sacrifice be in vain." The transmission lasted 15 seconds, long enough to ensure her final words would be recorded by both friendly and enemy forces, creating a permanent record of her last moments. As she released the radio transmit button, the first shots echoed across the mountainside. The firefight lasted 17 minutes and would later be reconstructed from enemy radio intercepts, satellite imagery, and the testimony of rescue personnel who arrived at the scene. What emerged was a portrait of a pilot who refused to surrender, even when facing impossible odds. Diana Kozlov's first shot dropped the lead fighter at 35 meters, a center-mass hit that demonstrated the marksmanship training that had made her expert qualified with both pistol and rifle. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley, alerting every enemy force in the region to her location. Return fire chipped granite fragments from her defensive position as automatic weapons raked the rocky outcropping. But Kozlov had chosen her position well. The massive boulders provided excellent cover, and the steep terrain made it difficult for attackers to achieve advantageous firing angles. Her second and third shots were equally precise, forcing the enemy patrol to take cover and call for reinforcements. Through intercepted radio communications, intelligence analysts later determined that at least 12 additional fighters were dispatched to her position, along with a mortar team and personnel trained in prisoner capture techniques. But as ammunition ran low and enemy forces closed in from multiple directions, Kozlov faced the reality that had haunted military aviators since the first pilot climbed into a combat aircraft. She was going to die in these mountains, far from home, surrounded by people who wanted to kill her. At 9:21 hours, during a brief lull in the gunfire, she made one final radio transmission that would be recorded by American intelligence assets and later transcribed for military historians. "This is Raven 7. I am down to my last magazine. They're closing in from 3 directions. Tell my squadron that I kept the faith. Tell them Valkyrie flew her last mission the way it should be flown, with honor." Her voice remained steady, professional, even as enemy fighters prepared for their final assault on her position. Years of training and an unwavering commitment to duty had prepared her for this moment, though no amount of preparation could make it easy. The final phase of the engagement began at 9:23 hours when enemy forces launched a coordinated assault on her position from 3 different angles. Kozlov's defensive fire was accurate and disciplined, each shot carefully aimed to maximize effect with her limited ammunition. But numbers eventually told. As her pistol clicked empty for the final time, Diana Kozlov faced the choice that had confronted warriors throughout history: surrender or die fighting. She chose to keep fighting. The last sounds recorded by American intelligence equipment were the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire and then, suddenly, silence. Satellite imagery showed enemy fighters approaching the rocky outcropping where Captain Diana, Valkyrie, Kozlov had made her final stand. What happened next would remain classified for decades, but the immediate aftermath was clear. The pilot who'd been dismissed as overcautious had died fighting like a warrior. The secure communications facility at Nellis Air Force Base erupted in controlled chaos as Captain Kozlov's final transmissions were received and analyzed. Her emergency radio broadcasts had been picked up by a Navy P-3 Orion conducting electronic surveillance over the region, and the recordings were immediately forwarded to the highest levels of military command. Colonel Webb stood in the communications center, listening to the crackling audio recordings of his pilot's final moments. The voice was unmistakably Diana Kozlov, calm, professional, defiant even in the face of certain death. But more importantly, the intelligence she'd transmitted about the enemy installation was already being analyzed by tactical experts. "Sir," announced Major Williams, the rescue squadron commander, "we've confirmed Captain Kozlov's position, but the tactical situation has deteriorated significantly. Enemy forces have cordoned off a 3-kilometer radius around her last known location. Any rescue attempt would face overwhelming opposition." Webb studied the tactical displays showing enemy positions, terrain features, and the growing concentration of hostile forces in the area. The mathematics of military rescue operations were unforgiving. Risking additional lives to recover someone who was almost certainly dead was a luxury they couldn't afford. But the intelligence Kozlov had transmitted was changing everything. Analysts had identified the enemy installation as a major coordination center for insurgent operations across the entire Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. The facility commanded supply routes, communication networks, and operational planning for dozens of terrorist cells. "Colonel," interjected Captain Nash from the intelligence section, "the target intelligence that Captain Kozlov transmitted is extraordinarily valuable. She identified what appears to be the command and control node for enemy operations in this entire sector. If we can strike this target. How soon can we launch? Webb asked, cutting through the analytical discussion. Sir, we could have strike aircraft over the target within 4 hours, but the enemy will be expecting retaliation. They'll have moved their high-value personnel and equipment by now. Webb considered the tactical situation. Kozlov's sacrifice had provided them with priceless intelligence, but only if they acted quickly enough to exploit it. Every hour of delay allowed enemy forces to relocate their assets and strengthen their defenses. At 11:47 hours, Webb made the decision that would define his military career. We launch immediate strikes on the installation that Captain Kozlov identified. Full strike package, every available aircraft. We make her sacrifice count for something. The orders went out across multiple communication channels. Within 2 hours, 24 aircraft from 3 different bases were converging on the enemy installation that Diana Kozlov had died to identify. It would be the largest air strike in the region in over 18 months. But even as the strike package approached their target, nobody at Nellie's Air Force Base knew the most important fact of all. Diana Kozlov was still alive. The enemy fighters who'd assaulted her position had found something unexpected when they reached the rocky outcropping. Instead of a dead American pilot, they discovered blood trails leading deeper into the mountain caves, evidence that their quarry had escaped during the final moments of the firefight. Captain Diana Valkyrie Kozlov was wounded, exhausted, and running low on ammunition, but she was alive and she was still fighting. The cave system that Diana Kozlov had crawled into during the firefight extended deep into the mountainside, carved by centuries of water flow and geological activity. Her right leg throbbed where shrapnel from an AK-47 round had torn through her flight suit, and her dislocated shoulder sent waves of agony through her body with each movement. But she was alive, hidden in darkness, while enemy forces searched for her body among the rocks above. Through the cave mouth, she could hear voices speaking in Pashto and Arabic, coordinating search patterns and discussing the tactical situation. They knew she'd escaped, but the cave system was extensive enough that finding one person could take days. Time was working in her favor, but her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Using her survival knife, she cut strips of fabric from her flight suit to create improvised bandages for her leg wound. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped entirely. Without proper medical attention, infection was inevitable. But infection was a problem for tomorrow. Today's challenge was staying alive long enough to see another sunrise. Her survival radio had been damaged during the firefight, the antenna snapped off by a ricocheting bullet. But the electronics still functioned, and she could hear fragments of radio traffic from the enemy forces searching for her. More concerning, she could hear increasing vehicle traffic on the mountain road below, suggesting that additional personnel were being brought in for the manhunt. At 14:30 hours, the sound that every pilot dreads echoed across the valley, the distinctive whistle of incoming aircraft. But as the sound grew louder, Kozlov realized these weren't enemy aircraft. The acoustic signature was wrong, the engine note too familiar. Through the cave entrance, she watched American strike aircraft passing overhead at high altitude, heading toward the enemy installation she'd identified. F-16 Fighting Falcons, A-10 Thunderbolts like her own, and what appeared to be B-1 Lancer bombers. It was a massive strike package, the kind of overwhelming force that suggested her intelligence had been received and acted upon. Minutes later, the horizon lit up with explosions as precision-guided munitions found their targets. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition or fuel storage areas had been hit. The enemy installation that had coordinated the SAM ambush was being systematically destroyed. But the airstrikes also had an unintended consequence for Kozlov's situation. Enemy forces throughout the region began converging on the area, some to assess the damage to their installation, others to continue the search for the American pilot who'd provided the targeting intelligence. As darkness fell on her second night in the mountains, Diana Kozlov faced a grim reality. Her physical condition was worsening, enemy forces were intensifying their search efforts, and her ammunition was down to a single magazine. Yet she'd accomplished something significant. The intelligence she'd transmitted had enabled a successful strike against a major enemy facility. Using her knife, she carved a message into the soft stone near the cave entrance. CPTDKOZLOV, USAF. I kept the faith. If her body was eventually found, whoever discovered it would know that she died as a United States Air Force officer, maintaining her honor to the end. But as she settled back into the deepest recesses of the cave to rest, Diana Kozlov had no intention of giving up. 12 years of military training, 3 combat deployments, and a lifetime of refusing to quit had prepared her for this moment. She was going to find a way home. The third day brought developments that would forever change how the Air Force thought about combat search and rescue operations. At 5:47 hours, a signals intelligence aircraft detected a weak emergency beacon transmitting from the mountainous region where Captain Kozlov had gone missing. The signal was intermittent and badly degraded, but the encryption signature matched her survival radio. Major Williams assembled her rescue team with the urgency of professionals who understood that time was running out. Every hour of delay reduced the chances of finding Captain Kozlov alive, assuming she was still alive at all. The beacon signal suggested either that she'd managed to repair her damaged radio or that enemy forces had recovered her equipment and were using it as bait for a rescue trap. The tactical situation remains extremely dangerous, Williams briefed her helicopter crews. Enemy forces have established a perimeter around the entire search area. We're looking at significant anti-aircraft threats, ground forces with heavy weapons, and terrain that makes evasive maneuvering nearly impossible. Captain Rodriguez, pilot of the lead HH-60 Pave Hawk, studied the mission briefings with the focused intensity of someone whose life would depend on understanding every detail. "Ma'am, what are the chances this is actually Captain Kozlov transmitting? Could be enemy forces trying to draw us into a trap." Williams had considered that possibility extensively. Using captured American radio equipment to lure rescue aircraft into ambushes was a known enemy tactic. But the alternative, abandoning a potentially live American pilot, was unacceptable to military doctrine and professional ethics. "We proceed as if she's alive until proven otherwise," Williams declared. "But we go in ready for a fight." The rescue mission launched at 1200 hours with 4 helicopters, close air support from A-10 aircraft, and electronic warfare support to jam enemy communications. It was a massive commitment of resources for what might be a recovery operation rather than a rescue, but the Air Force took care of its own. Meanwhile, deep in the cave system, Diana Kozlov heard the approaching helicopters and realized that her improvised beacon repairs had worked. Using components salvaged from her damaged survival radio and techniques learned during electronics training, she'd managed to create a weak but functional emergency signal. But getting to a location where she could be extracted would require leaving the relative safety of the cave system and exposing herself to enemy forces that were still actively searching for her. Her leg wound had become infected despite her improvised medical care, and fever was beginning to cloud her judgment. As the sound of helicopters grew louder, Kozlov faced another impossible choice. She could remain hidden in the caves, relatively safe but